Hello, I'm Amanda, a 36-year-old woman. The past few months have been really tough for me, and I'm having to relearn a lot of things. My husband, Franklin, caused a lot of the trouble I'm in, but a kind person stepped in and helped me avoid even more pain. First, let me tell you about the people in my story. The first person is my sister, Isla. She's 6 years younger than me and very pretty. Growing up, we didn't get along because I was a nerd and she was popular. She always picked on me and seemed jealous for some reason. My mom tried to help us get along, but it didn't really work. When I went to college, we didn't talk much, but after I graduated and she was a teenager, we started talking again. Our relationship got a little better, but we never got really close. That was the best we could do, and I was okay with that. Next, let me tell you about my ex-husband, Franklin. We met at work and got along really well. We dated for about 3 years before getting married. We worked hard and bought our first house together. I earned more money, so the mortgage and deed were in my name. After 2 years of marriage, Franklin asked me about having children. Honey, I was wondering about something, and I need you to think about this with an open mind. Alright, what is it? I've been thinking that we've been together for a while now, and maybe we could start a family of our own. Franklin, you know how I feel about that. I know, but we have the money for it, and it would be really cute to have little versions of us running around, don't you think? Yeah, but kids are a lot of work and responsibility. We're the most hardworking and responsible people we know. Come on, give it some thought. Okay, I promise I'll help take care of them. Just keep that in mind. Even though I wasn't keen on having kids, I gave in because Franklin kept bringing it up. First, we had a son, and 3 years later, we had a daughter. Initially, Franklin was very helpful, but that quickly changed. Suddenly, I was responsible for everything at home, including the kids. After our first child, Franklin insisted I stop working because he had gotten a promotion and was earning more than me. I tried to resist, but eventually, I decided it wasn't worth the fight and accepted my new role. To avoid getting bored at home, I took up a new hobby, hosting dinners. I often invited my mom and sister, who lived nearby, and my mother-in-law, Sonia, whenever she was in town. Eventually, I started to feel comfortable in my new life. I got to spend a lot of time with my family, and that made me happy. Franklin and I were doing okay. I had gone through some trauma after giving birth to our second child, where I almost died, which affected our relationship. I didn't think anything else was wrong, but oh, how wrong I was. As I was cleaning my room, I found a pair of panties that definitely weren't mine. My heart sank. As I stared at them, wondering if I wasn't enough for my husband, I had been feeling different lately. But I had just had our second child, it hadn't been over a year since then, and I was still recovering. I had been going to therapy, making slow progress, but it didn't seem enough because Franklin was cheating on me. Once the shock wore off, I was filled with anger and betrayal. I needed to know who my husband was cheating on me with and why. First, I sent Franklin a picture of the underwear and asked him whose they were. Then, I checked his laptop. I logged into his social media accounts and went through his chats. At first, I didn't see any unknown women, which confused me more. I looked through his messages but found nothing. In my desperation, I went through every chat, even though I knew it was foolish because everyone in his contacts was someone I knew. I couldn't believe that anyone in my life could hurt me that much. Then I realized that my sister's contact ID was everywhere I looked. At first, I didn't think much of it because why would my sister and husband talking be suspicious? But when I checked their chats, I felt sick to my stomach. They were full of pictures and videos of them in bed, messages about how much they loved each other, and plans for Franklin to leave me. I couldn't believe my own sister would do something so awful. Our relationship had never been perfect, but this was a whole new level of betrayal. First, I threw up because I was so disgusted. Then I tried calling Franklin, but he didn't answer. So, I called my sister. Isla, hey, what's up? Don't hey, what's up, me? Seriously, what's wrong with you? I don't know about mine, but I do know that I found a pair of your panties in my bedroom. Have you been sleeping with Franklin? Yeah, for a while now. Why, Isla? Seriously, you thought it was okay to sleep with my husband because you thought I was boring? And being my sister didn't even stop you. Look, I thought I was helping you out. I was keeping Franklin busy so you could focus on the kids. Are you serious? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Look, we didn't mean for it to go this far, okay? I only did it because he kept hitting on me, and he's a nice guy. But he was my husband. Why would you help tear our family apart? I just want what's best for Franklin, okay? If I'm the best for him, then so be it. You're disgusting. I hung up, unable to believe her nerve. I just lay in bed and cried. I never thought my life would come to this. Eventually, my youngest woke up crying, so I tended to her. I felt empty as I went through the motions of the day. I couldn't let my kids know something was wrong, they didn't need that worry. I picked up my older child from school, made dinner, and when they asked where their dad was, I lied and said he was working late. At some point, my anger turned into worry. It was almost 11 o'clock at night, and Franklin still wasn't home. I tried calling him multiple times, but he didn't answer. I even tried calling my sister to see if he was there, but she didn't pick up either. Exhausted from the day, I went to bed, hoping it was all just a bad dream. The next morning, I woke up feeling like something was wrong. I looked around and realized Franklin's things were gone from the room. I checked the cupboards and drawers, and most of his stuff was gone from the house too. He had left while I was asleep, without saying a word. I couldn't believe it. He just left me without even trying to talk. I didn't know what to do. All I could think about was taking care of my kids first, then I'd figure out everything else. I woke up, got the kids ready, dropped off the oldest at school, and then took the youngest to my mom's place. She could tell something was off because I was distant. All I could think about was how I'd managed to raise 2 kids alone. Whenever I came back to reality, I remembered I had to tell my mom about my sister and husband. Eventually, she couldn't wait any longer and asked what was wrong. Okay, I've had enough of your silence. What's going on? I don't know how to say this. Why are you? Start from the beginning. Well, I found out that Franklin has been cheating on me. What? How do you know? I found another woman's underwear in our room. When I asked Franklin about it, he didn't answer and then left. He left. What do you mean? When I woke up this morning, all his things were gone. Gone. You didn't try to stop him. I didn't even realize when he came back. I fell asleep around midnight, and when I woke up, all his stuff was gone. Oh my God, my poor girl, I'm so sorry this happened. Yeah, it gets worse. Oh no, what happened? Do you know who Franklin cheated on you with? You mean you know who he cheated with? Yeah, I snooped through his things to find out. I wouldn't have tolerated this under normal circumstances, but this is different. So, who is it? Isla. Excuse me. What? Are you serious? Yeah, my husband has been cheating on me with my own sister. I called her to ask about it, and she was so casual about it. She said they were in love and she believed she was the best for him, so she was going to keep being with him. Oh my God, what has she done? I don't even know how I'm going to survive. I have 2 kids to raise, and I need to find a job too. Look, why don't we just get some rest while I try to process this? I'll be here to help you, okay? Yeah, okay. Thanks, Mom. I had become numb to everything that had happened, so telling my mom wasn't as hard as I thought. I ended up sleeping while my mom took care of my youngest. When I woke up, I heard my baby crying and my mom yelling. I rushed out and saw my mom on the phone, looking angry. She hung up and seemed surprised to see me. She apologized for the noise but didn't say more. I knew she had been giving Isla a piece of her mind. Over the next few days, Mom stayed with us. It was easier having one person move in than three. Isla kept trying to contact our mom, but she asked me to block Isla. It was comforting to have someone understand my feelings when I felt so alone. I found out through mutual friends that Franklin and Isla got married. They reached out to me, concerned and confused. I had to explain everything, which was humiliating, but they were supportive. They all blocked Franklin and Isla and refused to associate with them. I found out they got married the day after Franklin left us. It hurt to know, but I shouldn't have expected anything different from them. When I told my mom, she was furious. You should know my mom is usually calm, so seeing her so angry with my sister was surprising. It was great to have her financial support. She wasn't obligated to help, but she did her best for us. She even helped me get job interviews because I wanted to contribute now that Franklin wasn't there to stop me. Taking care of the kids was manageable, but when they asked about Franklin, I had to hold back tears. Still, we got through it. A week later, I got a letter from Franklin. I didn't want anything to do with it. I figured it was some apology, but I was done with him. A week was too long to try to fix things, especially after he ran away from his family. So, I did the next best thing I could think of, I burned the letter. But afterward, I couldn't help but be curious about what it said. Sometimes, I wished I had read it before burning it, but then I reminded myself that nothing he could have said would change how I felt about him and what he did. The next day, my mom and I took the kids to the fair. We had a blast, and it was nice to be in a lively place after everything. I finally got to have fun and laugh, which felt great after such a tough time. That night, my mom and I relaxed with a bottle of wine, and I told her about the letter. So, something came in the mail for me last night. Oh. What was it? It was a letter from Franklin. What? What did it say? I don't know. What do you mean? You opened it, right? No, I didn't want to deal with anything he had to say, so I burned it. You burned it. Cow, what if they were official divorce papers? The envelope didn't look legal at all. I'm sure it wasn't that. Well, if you're sure. What do you think was in it? I don't know, maybe a weak apology or a request for his stuff back. I wouldn't be surprised. But how are you feeling about all of this now? Well, today was a good day. It's tough, especially when the kids keep asking where their dad is. What do I even tell them? It's slowly getting better, but only a little. As long as it's improving, I'm always here for you. And just so you know, I'm planning to cut ties with your sister. Everything I have will go to you and the kids. Oh, Mom, that means a lot. But are you sure? Maya is still your daughter. I know you and Isla had your differences, but what she did is unforgivable. I raised both of you better than this, and Isla clearly didn't care. So, she's no longer my daughter. I would have been upset if Mom changed her mind easily, but I knew Isla was still her child. I couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for Mom to make that decision because I could never do that to my kids. It made me even more grateful to have someone so supportive. Another 3 days passed, and I heard a knock on the door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone, and besides, my mom, who was at work, no one ever visited. I opened the door cautiously and saw 2 men in black suits. I only opened the door a little and asked who they were. They said they were lawyers and had something for me. They handed me a note and then a check. It was made out to me, and it was for $750,000. My jaw dropped at the hefty amount. I tried to tell them there must be a mistake, but they said there wasn't and urged me to read the note. The note began with, "Thank you for saving me." As I read on, I realized the money was from my mother-in-law, Sonia. She explained that she had visited us 3 days ago, but no one was home. She called Franklin, who tried to make it seem like he couldn't get in, but I had changed the locks after he left. Sonia sensed something was wrong with Franklin's behavior and pressed him until he confessed everything. She was disgusted by his actions. Sonia felt sorry for what I had gone through and decided to leave all her inheritance to me and her grandkids. She thanked me for preventing her from making a mistake and for not trusting her son with her assets. That's what the check was for. The lawyers then told me that Sonia had been terminally ill and had passed away just the day before. She wanted me to have the money right after her death to ensure her daughter-in-law and grandkids were well taken care of. Tears filled my eyes at Sonia's kindness and loss. She was truly remarkable, always standing up for what was right. It was one of the reasons Franklin had always been afraid of her. Yet, I found her comforting. She stayed true to her word and supported me until her last breath. A few days later, Franklin called. I already knew what he was going to say, but I decided to hear him out. "What did you do?" "What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean, Franklin. You'll have to be more specific." "What are you talking about? Why weren't you home that day?" "I specifically asked you to be. I sent you a letter asking you to pretend everything was normal while my mom visited." "Oh, was that what the letter said? You didn't read it?" "No, I burned it. You betrayed me. My mother was going to help me with the inheritance, but you took it all because you're selfish. That's ironic coming from you. You abandoned your family and only cared about contacting me when it involved your inheritance. Love can't be forced. I did what was best for me, and your mother did what was best for us. Don't ever try to contact me or the kids again. Goodbye." After that, things moved quickly. I filed for divorce, and I was granted full custody of the kids. Franklin tried to fight for the inheritance, but Sonia had made it clear that I was the one to receive it, so he didn't succeed. Franklin and Maya tried to pressure me into giving them some of the money, but I stood my ground and refused. Life has become easier since we got the money. I put a portion aside for my kids' college and invested the rest. My mom could retire, and I started working. My kids have come to terms with their dad not coming back, and when they're older, I'll tell them everything. I'm still hurting, but I know things can only get better from here.
I hadn't been searching for romance, not really. At 28, I was making waves in my finance career. Spreadsheets were my language of love, and my cubicle felt more like home than any social setting ever could. Then came the party hosted by Sarah, my coworker and closest friend, who had a knack for pushing me out of my comfort zone. The gathering was a diverse mix: Sarah's artistic and musical acquaintances, along with a few more conventional colleagues from the office. That's where I noticed him. He was engaged in a lively, good-natured debate with someone about the best way to preserve a historic brick building. Tall and slim with kind eyes and tousled dark brown hair, he wore a worn leather jacket over a faded t-shirt, likely featuring a band logo I wouldn't recognize. A stark contrast to my usual button-down and slacks crowd, but there was something captivating about him. "So you think slapping on a fresh coat of paint is the way to preserve history?" he said with a playful smile. Mark's eyes sparkled with interest as he spoke. "Preserving the structure is important, but don't you think the character and wear give the story more depth?" I found myself drawn closer, captivated by their lively discussion. Just then, Sarah appeared beside me, a playful gleam in her gaze. "Mark, this is the spreadsheet wizard I mentioned," she said, giving me a gentle push forward. Mark turned to face me, his smile broadening. "Spreadsheet wizard, eh? That sounds like quite the impressive skill," he remarked, his tone warm and intrigued. "It pays the bills," I replied, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. "But I can also hold my own in a conversation that doesn't involve amortization schedules." I winked at Sarah, who snickered. "Challenge accepted," Mark said, his voice warm and inviting. "So, Sarah, the spreadsheet wizard, what do you think about preserving history?" We ended up talking for hours about everything and nothing. He was an architect, passionate about restoring old buildings and giving them new life. I told him about my crazy hours at the firm and the satisfaction of closing a big deal. There were no awkward silences, just a comfortable flow of conversation that felt effortless. As the night wound down, we found ourselves standing by the railing overlooking the city skyline. The air was cool and goosebumps prickled my arms. This was fun, I admitted, surprised by the slight tremor in my voice. "Yeah," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the glittering cityscape. "I wouldn't mind doing this again sometime." "Me neither," I blurted out before I could overthink it. We met with Mark's parents, Martha and Arthur, at a fancy restaurant they picked. The conversation flowed easily enough at first. We talked about the wedding plans, the venue. I'd booked a beautiful old converted library, and the caterer I was stressing over. Turns out organic, locally sourced canapes are a pricey business. Then things took a weird turn. Martha, mid-bite of her lobster bisque, which she pronounced "bicey" with a forced accent, suddenly fixed me with a steely gaze. "So, Sarah," she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin, "Mark tells me you work in finance." "Yes, I'm a financial analyst at a large firm downtown," I replied, unsure where this was going. "Analyst, huh? Sounds important," Arthur chimed in, his voice booming across the table. "You must do well for yourself." Mark, who had been mostly quiet up until this point, cleared his throat. "Dad, come on. That's not what we're talking about. Just making conversation." "Son," Arthur said, waving his hand dismissively. He turned back to me. "So, Sarah, you mentioned a firm. Big name, I presume." I told him the name of the firm, a global player in the financial world. A satisfied smile spread across Martha's face. "Excellent," she declared. "And you say you do well for yourself. Investments, stocks, that kind of thing?" "Yes, I manage a portfolio," I replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. This felt more like an interrogation than a meeting with my future in-laws. "A portfolio, huh?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "How much are we talking about here, dear?" My jaw dropped. This was outrageous. Nobody, not even my closest friends, asked questions like that. I glanced at Mark, hoping he'd step in, but he just avoided my gaze, fiddling with his breadbasket. "That's really personal information, Mrs. Miller," I said, forcing a smile. "Oh, come on, honey," Martha huffed. "We're practically family now. Isn't that right, Mark?" Mark mumbled something non-committal, his cheeks flushed pink. I decided to take matters into my own hands. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "money isn't everything. Mark and I love each other, and that's what matters most." "Love is great, sweetheart," Arthur chimed in again, "but let's face it, love doesn't pay the bills." I took a deep breath. This dinner was turning into a disaster. "Maybe we should stick to talking about the wedding," I suggested, hoping to change the subject. The next morning, I called my grandma. As soon as I hung up with her after recounting the dinner with Mark's parents, a wave of doubt washed over me. Her words, "greedy and selfish people," echoed in my head, but I brushed it off. Grandma could be a bit old-fashioned sometimes. Sure, Martha and Arthur were a little blunt, but they seemed genuinely happy for us. Maybe they were just a bit awkward when it came to expressing their emotions. Fast forward a few months, and wedding planning was in full swing. Everything from the venue to the flowers felt like pulling teeth. Whenever money came up, Mark would give a sheepish shrug and say, "Work's been a bit tight lately." His parents, bless their hearts, kept offering suggestions, cheaper venues outside the city limits, a family friend who did amazing catering for a discount meaning they'd barter for vegetables from their neighbor's garden. Needless to say, I ended up footing most of the bill. Mark, ever the charmer, would say things like, "You're amazing, honey, handling everything like a champ," but his lack of financial contribution started to grate on me. Finally, the big day arrived. It was beautiful. The weather cooperated, the food was delicious, and most importantly, Mark and I said, "I do." The only sour note was Grandma. After the ceremony, she pulled me aside, her wrinkled face etched with concern. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice low, "be careful with those in-laws of yours. They don't have your best interests at heart." I rolled my eyes. "Here we go again, Grandma. They're just excited. They love Mark. They love me. Everything's fine." The honeymoon phase was barely over, with the leftover wedding cake still sitting on the counter, when the first major in-law incident occurred. It was a Sunday morning, and Mark and I were still luxuriating in bed when a loud thump from downstairs shattered the peaceful silence. We exchanged a confused look. Then Mark mumbled, "Probably the mailman." The thump was followed by a cacophony of rustling paper and muffled exclamations. Throwing on robes, we hurried downstairs to find a scene that could have been ripped straight out of a horror movie. Well, a horror movie with a lot of floral wrapping paper and gaudy gift bags. Martha and Arthur were sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by wedding presents like vultures picking over a carcass. They were tearing into boxes, oohing and ahhing over some items, tossing others aside with dismissive grunts. "What in the world is going on here?" I demanded, my voice laced with disbelief. Martha, mid-unwrap, looked up and flashed a megawatt smile. "Sarah, darling, just admiring your lovely wedding gifts." "Admiring?" I sputtered. "It looks more like you're ransacking the place." Arthur, holding up a crystal vase and squinting at it, snorted, "Relax, sweetheart. Just sorting things out. Can't have all this clutter lying around, can we?" Clutter. These were gifts chosen with love, hopefully by our friends and family. But before I could voice my outrage, Mark spoke up. "Maybe they should just leave the presents unopened, right?" he said, his voice mild. "Exactly," I chimed in. Rel wasn't completely oblivious. Martha scoffed. "Don't be silly, honey. It's rude not to open presents. Besides," she added, her eyes gleaming, "we might find something truly special in here." Special for them? That much was clear. I watched in growing frustration as they picked through the gifts, setting aside anything that caught their fancy. A silver picture frame, a set of engraved wine glasses, a fancy cheese board. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "These are our wedding gifts," I said, my voice firm. "Not yours to take." "Look, honey," Martha said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We just saw some things that would look lovely in our new house. You know, the one we're decorating." They were redecorating with our wedding gifts. The anger bubbled up inside me, threatening to spill over. "What about the gift you got us?" I asked, my voice tight. Martha paused, her hand hovering over a box wrapped in fancy floral paper. She rummaged through the pile, finally pulling out a small, oddly shaped package. With a flourish, she handed it to me. I unwrapped it slowly, my heart sinking with each layer of tissue paper. Inside was a cheap glass statuette, the kind you'd find at a discount store, adorned with garish plastic flowers. My stomach churned. This was their idea of a wedding gift. Maybe Grandma was right. Maybe I'd married into a nightmare. The wedding gift incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Martha's shopping spree became a regular occurrence. She'd call all chipper and ask me to join her for a girls' day out. What it actually meant was me being her unpaid personal shopper. We'd browse stores, and inevitably, Martha would find something she absolutely must have. Then at checkout, she'd do this weird shuffle with her purchases and mine, muttering about forgetting her wallet and how it's such a hassle with separate bags. By the time the cashier figured it all out, I'd be stuck paying for both our stuff. Arthur wasn't much better. Weekends were his prime visiting time. He'd waltz in unannounced, plop himself down on the couch, and proceed to spend the entire day glued to the TV, inhaling whatever snacks I had on hand. When I finally built up the courage to ask him why he spent so much time at our place, he looked at me with a straight face and said, "Saves money on groceries and electricity, doesn't it?" The audacity of the man. Did he think we were running a charity? Mark, ever the peacekeeper, just rolled his eyes and muttered something about Dad just needing some company. The birthday dinner was the final straw. I decided to treat myself to a nice night out at a fancy restaurant to celebrate another year older and hopefully wiser. Naturally, I invited Martha and Arthur. Big mistake. The menu was a confusing array of French names and unfamiliar ingredients. Undeterred, Martha and Arthur ordered the most expensive dishes, pronouncing them with a confidence that belied their complete lack of knowledge. Halfway through the meal, Martha declared the escargot too slimy and pushed the plate away. Arthur choked on a mouthful of bouillabaisse, spraying a gout of saffron broth across the table. The entire evening was a disaster. By the time the bill arrived, my blood pressure was through the roof. The cost of that meal could have fed us for a month. And guess who offered to chip in? Nope, not Mark. He just sat there, oblivious, while I choked out a strained thank you to the waiter and reached for my credit card. Back home, fuming and frustrated, I finally confronted Mark. "How can you just let your parents walk all over you like that?" I demanded. "Come on, babe," he said dismissively. "It's not a big deal. They're just, like that." "Like what?" "Selfish and entitled." "Mark, this isn't okay." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I love you, but you've got to pick your battles. My parents are, well, my parents. They're not going to change." Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been naive hoping to change them, to somehow mold them into the in-laws I'd always dreamed of. But the reality was staring me in the face. Martha and Arthur were who they were, and that wasn't going to change. The birthday dinner debacle was a turning point, but not the end. The in-law gift-giving strategy became painfully clear. Shower us with cheap, impersonal trinkets on holidays and expect extravagant presents in return. A framed picture of a lighthouse for Christmas. Try a top-of-the-line espresso machine for Mother. When my husband found out that I couldn't inherit my father's estate, he screamed at me. "What? You can't inherit the property. I have no use for you anymore. We're getting divorced right now." Later, I got my revenge on my newly remarried husband and sister. My name is Linda, a 32-year-old office worker, and I've been married to Richard for 2 years. I met Richard through a relative's introduction, and we got married. My family had some wealth, but since my sister Susan and I were the only children, our relatives were worried about the inheritance and introduced me to my husband. After that, my husband started living with us at my family home. My mother passed away a few years ago, and my father, my husband, and I lived together. My husband seemed very kind and treated my father well, but a relative who introduced him to me said something concerning just before our wedding. "I know I introduced Richard to you, but be careful. He's a bit obsessed with money." I was troubled by this warning so close to our wedding, but I didn't notice any signs of grief from my husband, so we went ahead and got married. Even after marriage, I kept an eye on my husband because of the relative's words, but he didn't seem obsessed with money. However, he did seem curious about my father's wealth, casually asking how much property we had when they were drinking together. My father openly talked about it, so I didn't worry too much. Another thing my husband was interested in was my sister. My sister is 5 years younger than me, lively and outgoing, in contrast to my calm demeanor. Her relationships with men are quite flashy. She doesn't look like me, and my husband was surprised when he first saw her. Susan is quite different from Linda, isn't she? Seeing my husband fascinated by my beautiful sister, the complete opposite of plain and unnoticeable me, made me feel complicated. But the relatives introduced me as a quiet and plain-looking person because they were worried that if I didn't get married, there would be no one to inherit the family home. I thought there was no need to worry since I had a beautiful sister, but later I understood why the relatives were concerned. My father spoiled my sister, letting her go to college and even community college. After graduation, my sister didn't have any particular goal in attending college or community college. She simply didn't want to work. My mother tried to persuade her to get a job right after college, but my father insisted on letting her go to community college. After graduating from community college, my sister got a job at my father's acquaintance's company but quit after only 6 months. Her excuse for quitting surprised me. I can't showcase my talents at that company. My mother and I were dumbfounded by my sister, who talked as if she understood everything about the job even though she hadn't worked for even half a year. But my father believed her and quickly found her another job. After she started working at the new company, my mother fell ill and was hospitalized. When my mother was hospitalized, my sister visited the hospital every day, constantly taking time off work. She eventually quit this job too, saying she needed to take care of my mother, but her care was just sitting in the hospital room chatting with my mother or staring at her mobile phone in the waiting room. I had to go to the hospital to change my mother's laundry, and my sister was no help at all. My mother might have been happy to have someone to talk to, but about a month after being hospitalized, her condition worsened to the point where she couldn't even speak. Within 2 weeks of her condition worsening, my mother passed away. My father and sister were so shaken by the sudden news that they couldn't even prepare for the funeral, so I had to take care of everything. Thanks to the cooperation of our relatives, we were somehow able to send my mother off peacefully. After my mother's death, my sister started a part-time job and moved out to live on her own, since her part-time earnings weren't enough to cover the rent. My father had been paying for her rent and utilities, and it seems she's using the money she earns for fun. Whenever her part-time salary isn't enough, she goes to my father to get some extra money. When my mother was alive, she was strict with my sister, so my father didn't give her any allowance, and now he gives her as much as she wants. I thought it was no problem if both my father and sister were satisfied with this arrangement. Even after I got married and started living with my husband in my parents' home, my father continued to give my sister an allowance. I didn't notice at the time, but my sister was also asking my husband for money, and he was happily giving it to her. He couldn't say no to my beautiful sister and would give her money, saying, "Keep this a secret from Linda. If she finds out, she might get jealous." My sister seemed to be living off the money she got from my father and husband, going to her part-time job whenever she felt like it. But that lifestyle didn't last forever. It ended when my father fell ill and had to be hospitalized. I was taking care of my father, visiting the hospital between work, but my sister never showed up. Instead, she started calling me, demanding money. "I've been getting money from Dad every month, so keep giving it to me. The rent and public utilities are all being deducted from Dad's account." She spoke to me in an angry tone, but I was surprised by the facts I learned for the first time. I was furious at my sister, who cared only about her life and not about our hospitalized father. I really wanted to hang up on her, but she seemed to be in trouble, so I asked her, "How much money has Dad been giving you every month? How much are you getting from Dad every month?" "Get a full-time job and live on the money you earn," I advised my sister. She answered grumpily, "Stop nagging. I'm getting $1,000 a month. Rent is separate, you know." I was dumbfounded by my sister, who proudly told me the amount. I thought that if I kept giving this much money to my grown-up sister every month, she would never feel like working. Seriously, I didn't think it was a big problem to give money to my sister, as I thought my father would recover soon after being hospitalized. However, my father's condition suddenly worsened, and I hurriedly contacted our relatives. The doctor also told me it was a serious situation, and I was quite shocked. I wanted my husband's support during this time, but he rarely visited the hospital, claiming he was busy with work. Moreover, when he did show up, he would ask me inappropriate questions like, "Joseph's inheritance must be huge, right? Since you and your sister are the only heirs, are you gonna split it in half?" I had no words to respond to my husband, who only talked about the inheritance. I felt both realization and disgust, understanding what the relatives meant when they said my husband was obsessed with money. When I called my sister to tell her about our father's critical condition, she was only concerned about her money. "More importantly, make sure you pay me every month. I can live without that money." The call ended abruptly, and I was furious at my sister's words. But I was also concerned about the faint male voice I heard on the other end of the phone. I had a bad feeling recognizing that voice. About a month later, my father passed away, and neither my sister nor my husband were there in his final moments. Having experienced my mother's funeral, I knew how heavy the task of preparing for a funeral could be. Moreover, neither my husband nor my sister helped with anything, and my sister didn't even attend the funeral. My husband did show up, but he disappeared right after, saying he had work. A relative who introduced me to my husband noticed his absence and asked me, "Where's Richard? It's strange for the host's husband to not be here, isn't it?" I could only respond with a wry smile. "He's busy with work, so he went home." The relative sighed at my answer, but I felt like sighing too. After my father's funeral ended, and I finally had a moment to breathe, my husband asked me with a sleazy grin, "Finally, how much did you inherit? Even if you split it in half, you must have inherited a considerable amount, right?" Just as the relatives had warned me before marriage, my husband seemed consumed with thoughts of my father's inheritance. My sister got $92 million, and I got zero. I hadn't even talked to the lawyer yet, and I was still trying to process the funeral. Looking at my husband, who was happily talking about the inheritance, I felt like laughing more than getting angry. My husband, who believed my words, immediately yelled, "What? You can't inherit any property? I don't need you anymore." "Divorce now," my husband declared. I felt the same way, so I shot back, "Let's do it. You married me for my father's inheritance in the first place. I'll divorce you." I shouted and thrust the prepared divorce papers at my husband. He seemed a little flustered, as if he had anticipated this, but he signed them anyway. As he left the house after signing the divorce papers, he said, "I'll divorce you, who gets zero inheritance, and remarry your sister Susan, who gets the $92 million, and left. I didn't care about his words and immediately proceeded with the divorce. I was able to part ways with my terrible husband. My ex-husband seemed to have started the process of marrying my sister the very next day. A few days later, I received a call from my ex-husband. "Do you still believe that story? When will you handle the inheritance? Hurry up and give Susan the $92 million, my ex-husband yelled over the phone. I had been waiting for him to contact me. I didn't want to reach out to my ex-husband, who had left the house on his own. I replied to him in a businesslike tone, "Let's discuss this at my place next Sunday. I'm preparing for the procedure and will be waiting." Thinking he would receive the inheritance, my ex-husband happily hung up. But I was looking forward to seeing his face when he learned the truth. On the weekend, my ex-husband and sister came to my family home. Surprised to find that I had called a lawyer, my ex-husband seemed to convince himself, "Of course, you need a lawyer when inheriting a large sum of money." Then the lawyer turned to my ex-husband with a puzzled look and began to speak, "Compensation claim. Before we can discuss the inheritance, there's the matter of Linda's compensation claim against Richard. He showed my ex-husband several photos featuring him leaving my sister's house, with clear dates marked. The lawyer addressed my ex-husband. These are evidence photos of infidelity before the divorce was finalized, so you must pay compensation. I had heard my ex-husband talking about the inheritance over the phone with my sister and immediately asked the lawyer to investigate his infidelity. Perhaps they thought I was distracted by my father's funeral, but my ex-husband and sister met at her house almost daily, allowing me to gather plenty of evidence. The conversation shifted from inheritance to compensation, leaving my ex-husband and sister dumbfounded. But my ex-husband quickly recovered and retorted, "Compensation is nothing compared to the $92 million from the inheritance. I'll pay it right away." He signed the compensation claim documents handed to him by the lawyer, acting all high and mighty. I confirmed it and told him, "Enjoy your life with my sister who inherited zero. Since you signed, I'll make sure you pay the compensation." The moment they heard inheritance zero, my sister screamed, "Why is my inheritance zero?" My ex-husband turned bright red and angrily said, "There's no way the inheritance is zero. I won't allow you to take it all for yourself." The lawyer calmly began to explain to the furious pair, "Susan is already the stepdaughter of your late mother, and since she was not legally adopted by your late father, there is no legal parent-child relationship. Therefore, Susan cannot inherit your father's estate." I explained to my confused sister, "When our parents remarried, Susan was only about a year old, and I clarified that our parents never legally adopted each other's children. I was 6 years old when our parents remarried, and I remember being happy to suddenly have a sister. However, I never thought that sister would later betray me by stealing my husband. Both parents struggled with young children, and there was a mediator who thought it best for them to remarry. My mother loved me like her real daughter, and my father cherished my sister. Perhaps my father spoiled my sister because she wasn't his biological daughter, and he wanted to be extra careful. Although both parents remarried with children, my mother, suspected by relatives of targeting my wealthy family's assets, refused to legally adopt my sister. The relatives only recommended marriage proposals to me because they knew I was the only one who could inherit my father's property. Now I understand that my father continued to support my sister financially even after she became an adult because he couldn't pass on his inheritance to her. I also never legally adopted my mother, so we weren't legally parent and child, but it never mattered in our daily lives. It seems my parents never told my sister that they were both remarried, and she only learned the truth today. My ex-husband seemed to understand the situation immediately, his face turning from bright red to pale blue. He had not only failed to get the inheritance he was expecting from my sister, but had also signed documents to pay compensation. With a blue face, my ex-husband asked me, "Was what you said? My sister gets $92 million and I get nothing a lie?" I held back my laughter and replied, "Of course it's a lie. It's to get back at you for cheating on me behind my back. Besides, there's no way a bankrupt inheritance would be worth $92 million. Even my wealthy father didn't have $92 million in inheritance." Suddenly, my sister, who had been silent, screamed, "I've been counting on Dad's inheritance and have done a lot of shopping. What will happen to the money Dad used to pay me? Will Linda pay for it?" I answered my frightened sister, "You have a reliable husband now, so you don't need it anymore, do you? Let Richard support you." My sister stared at her pale-faced ex-husband, who shook his head in response. "I've also done a lot of shopping, expecting the inheritance, so I can't afford it. Besides, I have to pay compensation, so I'm at my limit." After saying this, my husband suddenly began to apologize deeply to me. "Linda, I'm sorry, it was my fault. Will you forgive me and start over?" The lawyer, watching this, was laughing as he prepared to leave. Where had the arrogant attitude gone when he first came to the house? His deep apology looked ridiculous. After the discussion, my ex-husband and sister left dejectedly, and they soon divorced. For my ex-husband, who remarried with the goal of inheriting from my sister, he seemed to have no interest in her since he didn't get the inheritance. He even said to himself that, with the payment of compensation to me, he couldn't take care of my sister. My ex-husband had no assets, so it was decided to pay the compensation in installments from his monthly salary. The lawyer advised me that this way I wouldn't miss out. My sister, without the support of our father, had to work part-time every day, but she couldn't make the debt payments and ended up filing for personal bankruptcy. Afterward, she even gave up her condominium and disappeared, and no one knows where she went. My father had been supporting my sister financially, but by spoiling her like that, she became unable to work seriously. Afterward, I started living alone in my family home, and some relatives talked about introducing me to a potential marriage partner, but I declined. I didn't want to be introduced to another man like my ex-husband, so this time I want to find a marriage partner on my own.
The envelope sat innocuously on Henry's desk, its crisp white edges a stark contrast against the polished mahogany surface. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly, an inexplicable sense of dread coiling in my stomach. As I slid the letter out, the unmistakable scent of a woman's perfume wafted up, a sickly sweet aroma that made my head spin. "Ruth, darling, what are you doing?" Henry's voice startled me, and I whirled around. The letter clutched in my hand, like a damning piece of evidence. "Who is Mary?" I demanded, my voice quivering with a mixture of anger and disbelief. Henry's face paled, and he stumbled back, clutching his chest. "Where did you find that?" he gasped, his eyes wide with panic. I thrust the letter towards him, the words tumbling out in a rush. "In your desk drawer, along with a dozen others. Love letters, Henry? From a woman half your age?" He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, he doubled over, his face contorted in pain. "Ruth, you have to call an ambulance," he choked out, his fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my ears, a lifetime of resentment and hurt bubbling to the surface. "No, Henry," I said, my voice steady and cold. "You can manage alone, just like you always wanted." His eyes widened in shock, and he reached out a trembling hand towards me. "Ruth, please." But I had already turned away, the letter crumpled in my fist. I strode out of the study, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of our once perfect home. In the kitchen, I poured myself up a glass of wine, my hands shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the bottle. I sank into a chair, the cool liquid a welcome balm against the burning rage that consumed me. How could he? After everything we'd been through, after all the sacrifices I'd made for him, for our marriage? I thought back to the early days, when his charm and intellect had swept me off my feet. I was a passionate literature teacher then, my life brimming with purpose and dreams. Henry had seemed like the perfect partner, someone who understood and appreciated my love for the arts. We'd spent countless evenings discussing poetry and philosophy, our minds and souls intertwined in a beautiful dance of shared passions. But slowly, imperceptibly, the dynamic had shifted. Henry's ambition had taken precedence, and he'd insisted that I give up my teaching job to support his career. At first, I'd acquiesced, convinced that it was a temporary sacrifice for the greater good of our partnership. How naive I'd been. The years had slipped by, and I'd found myself increasingly isolated, my dreams and aspirations withering away like neglected flowers. Henry's control had tightened, his criticisms and belittling remarks chipping away at my self-worth until I was little more than a shell of my former self. And now this ultimate betrayal. I drained the glass, the wine leaving a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. Enough was enough. I would not be a victim any longer, a mere footnote in the story of Henry's life. It was time to reclaim my narrative, to write a new chapter where I was the author, the master of my own destiny. I squared my shoulders, a newfound resolve coursing through my veins. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in decades I felt alive, a spark of hope igniting within me. Henry could keep his mistress and his lies. I was done playing the role of the dutiful, subservient wife. It was time for Ruth Parker to take center stage. I sank deeper into the plush armchair, cradling the glass of wine like a lifeline as memories flooded my mind. How had it all gone so wrong? The first time I laid eyes on Henry, it was at a community theater production of Shakespeare's Hamlet. I was captivated by his commanding presence on stage, his rich baritone voice resonating through the auditorium. After the show, a group of us had gathered at a local cafe to discuss the performance, and that's when I met him. He was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on the play. We debated the nuances of Hamlet's character, our words dancing in a delightful tango of intellectual discourse. By the end of the evening, I was smitten. Our courtship was a whirlwind of shared passions and dreams. Henry was pursuing his law degree, and I was a dedicated literature teacher, pouring my heart into shaping young minds. We were kindred spirits, united in our love for the arts and our ambitions. On our wedding day, I remember standing before him, my heart swelling with joy and hope for the future we would build together. His vows promised a partnership of equals, a commitment to supporting each other's aspirations and nurturing our individual growth. Those first few years were blissful. We attended poetry readings and art exhibitions, our conversations flowing like a gentle stream, nourishing our souls. Henry was attentive and supportive, and I basked in the warmth of his affection. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tides began to shift. Henry's career took precedence, and he insisted that I leave my teaching job to focus on supporting his ambitions. At first, I acquiesced, convinced that it was a temporary sacrifice for the greater good of our partnership. "It won't be forever, my love," he had assured me, his eyes shining with ambition. "Once I've established myself, you can pursue your passions again." Foolishly, I believed him. The years trickled by, and my dreams withered like neglected flowers. Henry's control over our lives tightened, his criticisms and belittling remarks chipping away at my self-worth. I became a shadow of my former self, a mere accessory to his success. Whenever I broached the subject of returning to teaching, he would dismiss me with a wave of his hand. "You know how demanding my career is, Ruth. We can't afford any distractions right now." And so I remained trapped, my once vibrant spirit slowly suffocating under the weight of his dominance. It wasn't until Edna, Henry's mother, fell ill that I glimpsed a glimmer of hope. Henry insisted that we move into her home to care for her, and I reluctantly agreed, desperate for any change in my stagnant existence. Edna was a formidable woman, her sharp tongue and critical nature a constant source of tension. But as the months wore on, something unexpected happened. Beneath her prickly exterior, she began to see the genuine kindness and patience I exhibited, qualities that her son seemed to have forgotten. In those rare moments when Henry was absent, Edna and I would share quiet conversations, and a tentative bond formed between us. She saw the toll Henry's neglect and control had taken on me, and her eyes would soften with a mixture of pity and understanding. "You deserve better, my dear," she whispered to me one evening, her frail hands squeezing mine. "Don't let him break your spirit." Her words were like a lifeline, a reminder of the woman I once was, the woman I still longed to be, and then, just like that, she was gone. Edna's passing should have been a relief, a chance to breathe after months of grueling caregiving, but instead it only served to magnify the gaping chasm that had formed between Henry and me. In the aftermath of her death, I found myself adrift, untethered from the fragile bond that had kept me anchored to our crumbling marriage. Henry retreated further into his work, his absence both physical and emotional, leaving me to navigate the turbulent waters alone. It was during this time that the true extent of his control over my life became glaringly apparent. Without Edna's presence, I was left with nothing but the suffocating silence of our once vibrant home, a constant reminder of the dreams I had sacrificed. "Ruth, you know I can't be bothered with trivial matters," Henry would snap whenever I broached the subject of my desires. "My career demands my full attention." His words cut deeper than any knife, stripping away what little self-worth I had left. I was nothing more than a burden, an afterthought in his relentless pursuit of success. Finances were another weapon in his arsenal of dominance. Henry had insisted on handling all our accounts, citing his superior financial acumen as justification. I was left with a meager allowance, just enough to cover basic necessities, while he indulged in extravagances without a second thought. "A woman of your age has no need for such frivolities," he would scoff whenever I expressed a desire for something beyond the bare essentials. His words stung, but I had learned to swallow my pride, to bury my dreams beneath the weight of his contempt. It was during one of our rare evenings together that the final blow came. I had mustered the courage to suggest taking a part-time teaching position at the local community college, a tentative step towards reclaiming a piece of my former self. Henry's reaction was swift and brutal. "Absolutely not," he thundered, his eyes narrowing into slits. "I will not have my wife gallivanting about like some common laborer." I recoiled as if struck, my heart shattering into a million pieces. "But Henry, it's just a few classes," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "It would mean so much to me." He slammed his fist on the table, the force of it rattling the dishes. "Enough! You will do as I say, or there will be consequences." In that moment I saw him for what he truly was, a tyrant, a man so consumed by his own ego that he would crush the very soul of the woman he claimed to love. As he stormed out of the room, I sank to the floor, my body racked with silent sobs. How had I allowed myself to become so diminished, so utterly powerless? It was then that I stumbled upon Edna's letter, tucked away in a drawer, her elegant script a stark contrast to the harsh reality of my life. "My dearest Ruth," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I have departed this world, leaving you to navigate the treacherous waters of my son's selfishness alone." I clutched the letter tightly, my eyes devouring each word as if it were a lifeline. "Henry has become a man I scarcely recognize, consumed by his own ambition and blinded to the beauty and strength that resides within you. You deserve so much more than the gilded cage he has constructed around your spirit." Tears streamed down my face as I read on, Edna's words resonating deep within my soul. "Do not let him break you, my dear. Find the courage to spread your wings and soar, for you were meant for so much more than this half-life of servitude." As I reached the end of the letter, a newfound resolve took root within me. Edna had seen the truth, had recognized the injustice of my situation, and in her final act she had given me the gift of validation. I was not the problem. Henry was. And in that moment, I made a vow to myself. No longer would I be a prisoner in my own life. It was time to reclaim my identity, to shed the shackles of Henry's control and embrace the freedom that had been denied to me for far too long. The path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope ignite within me. I was done being a spectator in my own story. It was time to take center stage. The news of Edna's illness hit like a ton of bricks. Henry's domineering mother had always been a formidable presence in our lives, her sharp tongue and critical nature a constant source of tension. "We'll have to move in with her," Henry announced one evening, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "She'll need round-the-clock care, and I can't be bothered with hiring nurses." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my lips. Henry's mind was made up, as it always was, and my opinion held no weight. Within a matter of weeks, we had packed up our lives and relocated to Edna's sprawling home on the outskirts of town. The atmosphere was suffocating, a constant reminder of the sacrifices I had made for this family. Edna's health was rapidly declining, and the burden of her care fell squarely on my shoulders. Henry was rarely present, his work taking precedence over everything else, as usual. "You knew what you were signing up for when you married my son," Edna would sneer, her eyes boring into me with a mixture of disdain and pity. I would bite my tongue, swallowing the retort that threatened to spill forth. What good would it do to argue with this bitter, ailing woman? The days blurred together in a haze of medication schedules, meal preparations, and endless cleaning. Edna was a demanding patient, her sharp tongue lashing out at the slightest perceived misstep. "Honestly, Ruth, can't you do anything right?" she would snap, her bony fingers gripping my arm with surprising strength. I would force a smile, my jaw clenched so tightly that it ached. "Of course, Edna, I'll do better next time." But there was no pleasing her, no respite from her constant criticism. Even Henry's rare visits did little to alleviate the tension, as he would simply nod along with his mother's complaints, his eyes averted from mine. It was during one of those interminable nights, as I sat by Edna's bedside, that something unexpected happened. Her usual acerbic demeanor had softened, her eyes taking on a faraway look. "You know, Ruth," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "you remind me of myself when I was younger." I stared at her, taken aback by the rare glimpse of vulnerability she was displaying. I had dreams, too, she continued, her gaze fixed on some distant point. But I let them slip away bit by bit until there was nothing left but bitterness and regret. A lump formed in my throat as I listened, her words striking a chord deep within me. "Don't make the same mistake I did, dear," she said, her frail hand reaching out to grasp mine. "Don't let my son break you." In that moment, I saw the woman she once was, the vibrant spirit that had been slowly crushed by the weight of her own choices. And in her eyes, I saw a glimmer of understanding, a recognition of the path I was treading. From that day on, something shifted between us. Edna's barbs lost their sting, and a tentative bond began to form. She would share stories of her youth, her dreams of becoming a painter, and I would listen with rapt attention, clinging to the hope that it wasn't too late for me. Edna's passing, when it finally came, was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. As I held her hand in those final moments, her eyes met mine, and I saw a silent plea, a plea for me to find the strength she had lost. In the aftermath of her death, I found myself adrift, untethered from the fragile connection that had kept me grounded. But Edna's words echoed in my mind, a constant reminder that I had a choice to make. I could continue down this path of subjugation, allowing Henry's dominance to strip away the last vestiges of my identity. Or I could heed Edna's warning and reclaim the life that had been denied to me for far too long. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly easy. I was done being a prisoner in my own story. It was time to take the pen and write a new chapter, one where I was the author, the master of my own destiny. The months that followed Edna's passing were a blur of exhaustion and emotional turmoil. The bond we had forged in her final days had awakened something within me, a glimmer of hope that I could reclaim the life I had sacrificed for Henry's ambitions. But as the days trickled by, that hope began to wane, crushed beneath the weight of Henry's indifference and my own mounting despair. "Ruth, I don't understand why you're making such a fuss," he would say, his voice dripping with condescension. "Mother's affairs are settled, and we can finally move on with our lives." Move on? As if the past 6 months of grueling caregiving, of bearing the brunt of Edna's demands while he remained absent, meant nothing. "Henry, I need your support," I pleaded one evening, my voice trembling with exhaustion. "I can't keep doing this alone," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Don't be ridiculous. You've managed just fine without me." His words cut like a knife, reopening the wounds of neglect and belittlement that had festered for years. I clenched my fists, struggling to maintain my composure in the face of his callous disregard. "I'm your wife, Henry," I said, my voice low and trembling with barely contained rage. "Not your servant, not your mother's caretaker, your partner." He met my gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. "And I'm your husband, Ruth. It's your duty to support me, no matter the sacrifices required." That was the breaking point. Years of suppressed anger and resentment came crashing down, a tidal of emotion that I could no longer contain. Duty? I spat, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "Is that what you call this miserable existence? A life of servitude, stripped of my dreams, my passions, my very identity?" Henry recoiled, taken aback by the fury in my voice. "Ruth, you're being hysterical. Calm down and listen to reason." "Reason?" I laughed bitterly. "What reason could possibly justify the way you've treated me, the way you've crushed my spirit beneath the weight of your ambition?" His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might strike me. But then his expression shifted, a flicker of something akin to fear passing across his features. "You ungrateful wretch," he hissed. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I met his gaze unflinchingly, my resolve hardening with each passing second. "No, Henry. It's you who have taken everything from me piece by piece until there was nothing left but a hollow shell." He opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, silencing him. "Enough. I'm done, Henry. Done with your lies, your manipulation, your utter disregard for my happiness." His eyes widened as I reached into the drawer of the end table, withdrawing the letter Edna had left me, the letter that had ignited the spark of rebellion within me. "Your own mother saw the truth," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of sadness and determination. "She knew the pain you inflicted upon me, and in her final act she urged me to find the strength to break free." Henry's face drained of color as I brandished the letter, the damning evidence of his mother's betrayal. "Ruth, please," he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate pleading. "We can work through this. I'll change, I promise." But his words rang hollow, a feeble attempt to cling to the control he had wielded for so long. I shook my head, my resolve unwavering. "No, Henry, it's too late for promises. I'm leaving, and this time it's for good." As I turned and walked away, my heart pounded with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years I felt alive, a fire burning within me that no amount of oppression could extinguish. I was free, and nothing, not Henry, not the ghosts of my past, would ever chain me again. The days following my declaration of independence were a whirlwind of activity. I had spent too long trapped in the gilded cage of Henry's making, and now that the door was open, I was determined to seize every opportunity for freedom. First on the agenda was securing my financial independence. For years, Henry had kept a tight grip on our finances, doling out meager allowances while indulging in extravagances without a second thought. But Edna's letter had included a surprising revelation, a sizable inheritance that she had left solely in my name. "Use it wisely, my dear," her elegant script had urged. "Build the life you deserve, free from the shackles of my son's control." With those funds, I was able to retain a fierce divorce attorney, a woman whose steely resolve matched my own. Together, we crafted an airtight case, documenting Henry's emotional abuse and financial manipulation with meticulous detail. Henry, of course, was livid when he discovered my intentions. "You ungrateful shrew," he spat, his face contorted with rage. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" I met his gaze unflinchingly, my resolve unwavering. "No, Henry. This is me reclaiming the life you stole from me, piece by piece." His eyes widened as I produced the divorce papers, the stark reality of my determination finally sinking in. "You can't be serious," he stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by a desperate pleading. "Ruth, please, we can work through this." But his words fell on deaf ears. I had heard enough empty promises, enough lies disguised as concern. This time, I held all the power, and I intended to wield it without mercy. "It's over, Henry," I said, my voice steady and resolute. "Sign the papers, or I'll have no choice but to take this to court." His jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might refuse. But then, something shifted in his expression. A flicker of fear, a realization that his control over me had finally shattered. With trembling hands he reached for the pen and scrawled his signature across the dotted line, sealing his fate and my freedom in a single stroke. As I turned to leave, a sudden commotion behind me made me pause. Henry had collapsed, clutching his chest and gasping for air. "Ruth, you have to call an ambulance," he choked out, his eyes wide with panic. I should have felt pity, remorse, something akin to the concern a wife should have for her ailing husband. But as I looked down at him, all I felt was a profound sense of detachment, a realization that this man had forfeited any claim to my compassion long ago. "No, Henry," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. "I don't have to do anything for you anymore." His eyes widened in shock, but I had already turned away, the weight of his pleas sliding off me like water off a duck's back. As I strode out of the house, my head held high, I felt a surge of exhilaration coursing through my veins. This was it. The moment I had dreamed of for so long, the moment when I finally broke free from the shackles of Henry's control. In that instant, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the strength and resilience that had been forged in the fires of my oppression. Henry's reign was over, and a new chapter in my life was just beginning. I was free, and nothing, not Henry, not the ghosts of my past, would ever chain me again. The days following my confrontation with Henry were a blur of activity, fueled by a newfound sense of determination and purpose. I had spent far too long trapped in the gilded cage of his making, and now that the door was open, I was determined to seize every opportunity for freedom. My first order of business was to seek refuge with the one person I knew I could count on, my sister Joyce. She had been a constant source of support throughout the years, offering a sympathetic ear and a shoulder to lean on whenever Henry's cruelty became too much to bear. When I showed up on her doorstep, suitcase in hand, she took one look at my face and ushered me inside without a word. Joyce had always been perceptive, able to read the depths of my emotions with a single glance. "It's over, Joyce," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of relief and trepidation. "I left him." Her eyes widened, and then she pulled me into a fierce embrace, her arms enveloping me with a warmth and acceptance that I had been denied for far too long. "Oh, Ruth," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so proud of you." In that moment, the floodgates opened, and years of pent-up pain and anguish came pouring out. I clung to Joyce, my body racked with sobs as I purged the toxicity that had been slowly poisoning my soul. Through it all, she held me, her strength and unwavering support a lifeline that kept me tethered to reality. In the days that followed, Joyce became my rock, my anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm me. She helped me navigate the legal intricacies of the divorce, ensuring that every step was taken to secure my independence and protect me from Henry's retaliation. And when the nightmares came, as they inevitably did, she was there, holding my hand and reminding me of the strength that had carried me this far. "You are a survivor, Ruth," she would say, her eyes shining with a fierce pride. "Never forget that." With Joyce's encouragement, I began to take tentative steps towards reclaiming the life that had been denied to me for so long. I sought out old friends, rekindling connections that had been severed by Henry's isolating grip. Their warm embraces and words of support were like balm to my wounded soul, reminding me that I was not alone in this journey. And slowly, bit by bit, the pieces of my shattered identity began to reform, like a delicate mosaic pieced together with care and determination. It was during this time that I received the news of Henry's hospitalization. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt, a lingering remnant of the dutiful wife I had been conditioned to be. But that fleeting moment of weakness was quickly overshadowed by a sense of resolve, a realization that I owed this man nothing. "He made his choices, Ruth," Joyce said, her voice firm but laced with compassion, "and now he must face the consequences." Her words resonated deeply, a validation of the path I had chosen. Henry's downfall was not my burden to bear. It was the inevitable result of his own actions, a reckoning long overdue. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, I felt a profound shift within me. The shackles of Henry's control had been broken, and in their place, a newfound sense of freedom and purpose took root. I was no longer defined by the confines of my marriage, no longer bound by the expectations and limitations imposed upon me. I was Ruth Parker, a woman reborn, with a future as vast and limitless as the horizon stretching before me. And as I stood on the precipice of this new chapter, I felt a surge of exhilaration and gratitude. The road ahead would undoubtedly be paved with challenges, but for the first time in decades, I was ready to face them head-on, armed with the strength and resilience that had been forged in the fires of my oppression. Henry's reign was over, and a new era, my era, had begun. The months that followed my departure from Henry's life were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. With Joyce's unwavering support, I navigated the legal intricacies of the divorce, ensuring that every step was taken to secure my independence and protect me from Henry's retaliation. It was during this time that I received an unexpected windfall, a sizable inheritance from Edna, left solely in my name. Her final act of defiance against her son's tyranny, a testament to the bond we had forged in her final days. "Use it wisely, my dear," her elegant script had urged. "Build the life you deserve, free from the shackles of my son's control." And so I did, channeling those funds into securing my own modest apartment, a cozy sanctuary where I could begin to rebuild the pieces of my shattered identity. But even as I reveled in my newfound freedom, the ghosts of my past lingered, whispering insidious doubts and fears. What if Henry refused to let me go? What if his thirst for control drove him to seek retribution? Those concerns were put to rest one fateful afternoon when a knock sounded at my door. I opened it to find Henry standing before me, a mere shadow of his former self. "Ruth," he rasped, his voice tinged with desperation. "Please, we need to talk." I steeled myself, determined not to let his pleas sway me from the path I had chosen. "There's nothing left to say, Henry," I replied, my tone firm but laced with a hint of pity. "The divorce is final. It's time for you to move on." His eyes widened, and for a moment I thought he might argue, might try to reassert the control he had once held over me. But then his shoulders slumped, and he nodded. a defeated man. "I never meant for it to go this far," he murmured, his gaze downcast. "I was a fool, Ruth, a fool who took the most precious thing in his life for granted." I said nothing, letting his words hang in the air between us, a bitter acknowledgement of the pain he had inflicted. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "for everything." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing from my life as abruptly as he had entered it all those years ago. In the weeks and months that followed, I focused on rebuilding the pieces of my life, one small step at a time. With the financial security of Edna's inheritance, I was able to pursue my long-dormant passion for teaching, securing a part-time position at the local community college. The first time I stepped into that classroom, a rush of emotions washed over me: excitement, trepidation, and above all, a profound sense of purpose. This was where I belonged, shaping young minds and igniting their love for literature, just as I had done so many years ago. As I stood before those eager faces, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the shackles of Henry's control finally falling away. I was no longer defined by the limitations he had imposed upon me. I was Ruth Parker, a woman reborn, with a future as vast and limitless as the horizon stretching before me. With each passing day, my confidence grew, nurtured by the support of my newfound community, colleagues who celebrated my passion, students who hung on my every word, and friends who had welcomed me back into their lives with open arms. And through it all, Joyce remained my steadfast ally, her unwavering belief in me a constant source of strength and inspiration. "Look at you, Ruth," she would say, her eyes shining with pride. "You've blossomed into the woman you were always meant to be." Her words resonated deeply, a validation of the long and arduous journey I had undertaken to reach this point. I had faced the depths of despair and emerged victorious, a phoenix rising from the ashes of my oppression. As the first anniversary of my newfound independence approached, I found myself reflecting on the woman I had been, the timid, broken creature who had allowed herself to be diminished by a man's cruelty. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for the freedom I had claimed, but for the resilience that had carried me through the darkest of times. I was a survivor, a warrior who had stared down the demons of her past and emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. And as I looked towards the future, I knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them head-on, armed with the knowledge that I was the master of my own destiny. Henry's reign was over, and a new era, my era, had begun.